The crystalline waters of Lake Serenity reflected the 3 moons of Valdris like scattered diamonds against black velvet. Princess Lorelei of the Aquatic Kingdom stood at the edge of the ceremonial pier, her blue-scaled skin shimmering with nervous moisture. The gills along her neck fluttered rapidly as she tried to control her breathing. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Instead, it felt like a death sentence. Behind her, the wedding procession waited in silence. Nobles from across the galaxy had gathered to witness the union between the Aquatic Kingdom and the proud Leonid Empire. At the head of the procession stood Prince Thrakis, his golden mane flowing in the gentle breeze. His amber eyes watched her with what others might mistake for love, but Lorelei knew better. She had seen those same eyes when he looked at his prized hunting trophies. "My princess," Thrakis called out, his voice carrying the commanding tone that made others bow in submission. "The ceremony awaits. Your people expect you to fulfill your duty." Lorelei's webbed hands trembled as she touched the traditional wedding crown upon her head. The pearls and aquamarine gems felt heavier than starship armor. She had worn this crown in her dreams since childhood, but never like this. Never as a chain binding her to a fate she despised. The Leonid prince stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over her. His people were known throughout the galaxy as fierce warriors, but Thrakis had earned a reputation even among his own kind for cruelty. Stories whispered of conquered worlds where he had shown no mercy, of diplomatic missions that ended in mysterious deaths. Yet the Galactic Council praised him as a strong leader, and her father had sealed the marriage contract without consulting her wishes. "You seem hesitant," Thrakis said, his clawed hand reaching toward her face. "Surely you understand the honor I bestow upon you. Your little water world will have the protection of the Leonid fleet. Your people will prosper under our strength." Lorelei pulled back from his touch. "This union was arranged for politics, not protection. My people have defended themselves for millennia without your help." Thrakis's eyes narrowed. "Your people are weak. They hide in their underwater cities, afraid to claim their rightful place among the stars. With Leonid blood in the royal line, future generations will have the courage their ancestors lacked." The insult cut deep, but Lorelei had heard worse from him during their brief courtship. The Leonid prince viewed her people as inferior beings, useful only for their planet's rare minerals and strategic location near the galactic trade routes. This marriage would give him legal claim to everything her ancestors had built. "Strength isn't measured only by conquest," she replied quietly. "My people understand patience, wisdom, adaptation. We've survived ice ages and solar flares. We've built cities beneath crushing ocean depths. That takes a different kind of courage." "Pretty words," Thrakis laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Let's see how much wisdom helps when raiders attack your shipping lanes. Let's see how adaptation serves you when the hive fleets return to this sector." He was right about the threats, and they both knew it. The galaxy had grown more dangerous in recent cycles. Pirates operated with impunity in the outer systems, and rumors spoke of the insectoid hive fleets massing beyond the galactic rim. The Aquatic Kingdom's defensive fleet was small, built for protection rather than expansion. But marriage to Thrakis felt like trading one form of destruction for another. "The guests grow impatient," the prince continued. "Your father expects this ceremony to proceed. The contracts have been signed, the dowries exchanged. There's no honorable retreat from this union." Lorelei looked back at the assembled crowd. Dignitaries from dozens of worlds watched expectantly. Her father sat in the place of honor, his face grave but determined. As king, he had made the choice he believed would save their kingdom. As a father, she could see the pain it caused him. Among the guests, she noticed a small group wearing the blue and silver uniforms of the Terran Federation. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 2 centuries ago. Most established civilizations still viewed them as curiosities, primitive beings who had somehow stumbled into technology beyond their understanding. The human delegation sat quietly near the back, seemingly forgotten by the other guests. Their ambassador was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair. Beside her sat two younger humans in military dress uniforms. One was a woman with short blonde hair and sharp features that spoke of military precision. The other was a man who looked barely old enough to have left his homeworld, with brown hair and gentle eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. Lyralii had met the human ambassador briefly during the pre-ceremony reception. Ambassador Sarah Chun had been polite but distant, following diplomatic protocol without the fawning behavior she'd observed from other delegations. The humans seemed genuinely interested in understanding other cultures rather than simply pursuing political advantages. "Your Highness," Thrakis said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "The priests are ready to begin. Will you take your place? Or must I carry you to the altar?" The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Lyralii looked at the ceremonial pool, where they would exchange vows according to aquatic tradition. The water was clear and warm, drawn from the sacred springs beneath the royal palace. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a place of joy and celebration. Now it felt like her grave. "I need a moment," she said, stepping closer to the pool's edge, "to pray for guidance from the depths." Thrakis' expression darkened, but he couldn't object without insulting her religious customs in front of the entire gathering. "Be quick about it," he growled. Lyralii knelt beside the water, her hands pressed together in the traditional gesture of supplication. But instead of praying, she found herself studying her reflection in the pool's surface. Her blue-scaled skin marked her as pure aquatic nobility, descended from the first colonists who had adapted to their world's endless oceans. Her large, silver eyes could see clearly in the deepest waters. Her webbed hands and feet made her as graceful underwater as any creature born to the seas. She was everything a princess of the aquatic kingdom should be. Everything except free. Behind her, she could hear the crowd growing restless. Whispered conversations carried on the evening breeze, some in languages she recognized, others completely alien. The diversity of the galactic community was on full display. Dozens of species gathered to witness what they believed would be a celebration of unity. Instead, it felt like a funeral for her dreams. "Princess," came a quiet voice behind her. She turned to see one of the human soldiers had approached. It was the young man with brown hair, the one who had been sitting with the Terran delegation. Up close, she could see he was older than she'd first assumed, perhaps in his late 20s. His uniform bore the insignia of a sergeant, and despite his youth, there was something steady and reliable in his demeanor. "Sergeant Marcus Webb, Your Highness," he said with a respectful bow. "I apologize for the intrusion, but Ambassador Chun asked me to check on your welfare. You seem distressed." Lyralii glanced back at Thrakis, who was engaged in conversation with several Leonid officials. The prince hadn't noticed the human's approach yet, but that wouldn't last long. "I'm fine," she said automatically, then realized how hollow the words sounded. "Thank you for your concern, but this is a private matter." Sergeant Webb nodded, but didn't retreat. "Of course, Your Highness. I just wanted you to know that the Terran Federation recognizes the sovereignty of all sentient beings. If you ever need assistance, we consider it our duty to help." There was something in his tone that made her look at him more carefully. His words carried weight beyond simple diplomatic courtesy. The humans had a reputation for unusual behavior by galactic standards. They formed alliances with weaker species, protected refugees without asking for payment, and had even been known to intervene in conflicts where they had no strategic interest. "The Terran Federation is small," she said quietly. "You have perhaps 50 worlds to the Leonid Empire's 1,000. What could you possibly offer that they cannot?" "Choice," Webb replied simply. "We believe every being has the right to determine their own fate. Sometimes that's worth more than all the fleets in the galaxy." Before Lyralii could respond, a heavy hand fell on her shoulder. Thrakis had finally noticed the conversation and approached with the predatory grace that marked his species. "Human," the prince said, his voice carrying clear dismissal. "Your presence here is a courtesy to your ambassador." Don't mistake that for permission to interfere in matters beyond your understanding. Webb straightened to his full height, which was still considerably shorter than the Leonid prince. But there was no intimidation in his posture, only calm professionalism. I meant no disrespect, Your Highness. I was simply conveying greetings from our delegation. Your greetings are noted, Thrakis replied coldly. Now return to your seat before I decide to take offense at your presumption. For a moment, the two men stared at each other. The prince's amber eyes burned with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged. The human's brown eyes remained steady, neither backing down nor escalating the confrontation. Of course, Webb said finally. He turned to Lyralii and bowed again. Your Highness, I hope you find the guidance you seek. As the human walked away, Thrakis' grip on her shoulder tightened. His claws pressed through the fabric of her ceremonial dress without quite breaking the skin. Interesting friends you're making, he said in a voice only she could hear. I trust you won't give me reason to discuss this conversation with their ambassador later. The threat was clear. Any perceived slight to Thrakis would be met with retaliation, possibly extending to the human delegation. Lyralii had heard enough stories about the prince's vindictive nature to take the warning seriously. It was nothing, she said, just diplomatic courtesy. Good. Thrakis released her shoulder and stepped back. Now, shall we proceed with the ceremony? The priests had been patient long enough. Lyralii looked one more time at the ceremonial pool, then at the crowd of expectant faces. Her father watched with resigned hope, trusting that she would do her duty for the kingdom. The other guests waited for the spectacle they'd traveled light years to witness. But her eyes found the human delegation in the back, where Sergeant Webb had resumed his seat beside his companion and ambassador. He wasn't looking at her, maintaining proper diplomatic distance. Yet somehow his presence felt like a reminder that alternatives existed, even when they seemed impossible. Yes, she said finally, rising to her feet. Let's begin. The ceremonial pool felt warm against her feet as she stepped into the shallow end. According to tradition, she and Thrakis would wade deeper together, symbolically joining their peoples as they joined their lives. The priests began their ancient chants in the flowing language of her people, words that had blessed royal unions for countless generations. But as the ceremony proceeded, Lyralii found herself thinking about the human's words. Choice, the idea that every being had the right to determine their own fate. It was a radical concept by galactic standards, where duty and tradition typically outweighed individual desires. The water rose to her waist as she and Thrakis moved deeper into the pool. Soon it would be time for the final vows, the words that would bind them together according to the laws of both their peoples. Once spoken, there would be no honorable way to break the union. Do you, Princess Lyralii of the Aquatic Kingdom, the High Priest intoned, take Prince Thrakis of the Leonid Empire to be your bonded mate, to share in joy and sorrow, in peace and war, until the stars themselves grow cold. The words hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring. Everyone in the gathering held their breath, waiting for her response. It should have been simple. 2 words that would secure her people's future and fulfill her father's wishes. Instead, Lyralii found herself paralyzed by doubt. The water around her seemed to grow heavier, pressing against her like the weight of expectations from every person present. She could feel Thrakis' eyes boring into her, demanding compliance. Her father's face showed desperate hope mixed with growing concern as the silence stretched beyond what was comfortable. She began, then stopped. The word hung incomplete in the air. In that moment of hesitation, everything changed. She could see the future stretching ahead of her, decades of marriage to a being who viewed her as property, watching her people slowly lose their independence under Leonid rule. Or she could choose differently. Without another word, Lyralii dove beneath the surface of the ceremonial pool. The warm water embraced her like an old friend, and for a moment she felt peace. Down here, in the depths that called to every part of her heritage, she could think clearly. But she couldn't stay underwater forever. When she surfaced, gasps and shouts erupted from the crowd. Thrakus stood where she'd left him, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. Her father had risen from his seat, confusion and fear warring in his expression. "What is the meaning of this?" Thrakus roared, his voice carrying across the water. "Have you lost your mind?" Lyralii treaded water in the center of the pool, her wedding dress floating around her like spread wings. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again. "I choose differently," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the shocked silence. "I cannot marry you, Prince Thrakus. Not today, not ever." The words sent shockwaves through the gathering. Delegates began talking urgently among themselves. Some seemed scandalized, others intrigued. The Leonid delegation looked ready for war. But somewhere in the back, she thought she saw the human sergeant nod with something that might have been approval. The choice was made. Now she had to live with the consequences. The silence that followed Lyralii's declaration lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats. Then chaos erupted across the ceremonial grounds like a storm breaking over calm seas. Prince Thrakus let out a roar that could have shattered crystal. His golden mane bristled with fury as he lunged toward where Lyralii floated in the center of the pool. The water barely reached his chest, but his movements sent waves crashing against the decorative stonework. "You dare humiliate me before the entire galaxy," he snarled, his claws extended. "I'll drag you to the altar myself, if necessary." But Lyralii had already dove beneath the surface again, her natural swimming abilities far superior to anything the land-dwelling Leonid could manage. She moved through the water with fluid grace, staying just out of his reach as he thrashed after her. The assembled guests erupted into frantic discussion. Some called for security, others demanded explanations. The Leonid delegation was on its feet, hands moving toward concealed weapons despite the supposed sanctity of the ceremony. Several alien dignitaries activated translation devices, trying to understand what was happening. King Nereon of the Aquatic Kingdom looked as though he'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. His advisors clustered around him, voices urgent and fearful. The marriage contract was more than a ceremonial document. Breaking it would be seen as an act of betrayal by the Leonid Empire, with potentially catastrophic consequences. "Seize her," Thrakus commanded his guards. "Bring the princess to me immediately." Several Leonid soldiers moved toward the pool's edge, but they hesitated when they realized the disadvantage water would give them. Their heavy armor and natural build made them powerful on land, but clumsy swimmers at best. Ambassador Chun of the Terran Federation stood slowly, her diplomatic training evident in every measured movement. Beside her, Sergeant Webb and Lieutenant Torres remained seated, but alert, their hands resting casually near their sidearms. "Perhaps," Ambassador Chen said in a voice that carried clearly across the grounds, "we should allow the princess to explain her decision before taking any irreversible actions." Thrakus whirled toward the human delegation, his amber eyes blazing. "This is not your concern, human. Your pathetic federation has no authority here. The Terran Federation recognizes the rights of all sentient beings," Chen replied calmly. "That includes the right to speak before being condemned." "She has already condemned herself," the prince shot back. The marriage contract was sealed by both kingdoms. Breaking it is an act of war. King Nereon finally found his voice, though it shook with strain. "Daughter, please, come out of the water. We must discuss this properly." Lyralii surfaced near the far edge of the pool, her silver hair streaming water like liquid starlight. Her ceremonial dress clung to her form, but she held herself with newfound dignity despite the chaos surrounding her. "There's nothing to discuss, Father. I cannot marry someone who views my people as inferior beings to be conquered and controlled. Your personal feelings are irrelevant." Thrakus bellowed. "Royal marriages are about duty, not sentiment." "Duty to whom?" Lyralii asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing. "To your empire's hunger for our resources? To your need for strategic bases in our sector? You speak of duty, but you mean submission." The accusation hung in the air like an explosive waiting to detonate. Several alien delegations exchanged meaningful glances. The Leonid Empire's expansionist policies were well known, but rarely criticized so directly by potential victims. "You speak treason," one of Thrakis' advisors declared. "The princess dishonors both kingdoms with these wild accusations." "Truth isn't treason," Lyralii replied. "Prince Thrakis has made his intentions clear during our courtship. He sees this marriage as the first step toward absorbing our kingdom into his empire. Our autonomy, our culture, our very identity would be erased within a generation." King Nereon's face paled. "Lyralii, these are dangerous words. Think carefully before." "I have thought carefully, father. I've thought about nothing else for months. This marriage would save our kingdom from immediate threats while destroying everything that makes us who we are." Thrakis had stopped trying to reach her physically, but his rage continued to burn bright. "Your kingdom is weak. Your people hide in their underwater cities while stronger races shape the galaxy's destiny. Union with the Leonid Empire would give you strength and purpose." "We don't need your definition of strength," Lyralii said firmly. "We've built a civilization that values wisdom over conquest, cooperation over domination. That's not weakness. That's a choice." The word choice seemed to resonate across the gathering. Ambassador Chen nodded slightly, while several other delegates began whispering urgently among themselves. The concept of choice in royal marriages was virtually unknown in most galactic civilizations. "Choice is a luxury your kingdom cannot afford," Thrakis said coldly. "The pirates in the Outer Rim grow bolder each day. The hive fleets mass beyond the galactic edge. When they come, your precious wisdom won't protect you." "Perhaps not," Lyralii admitted. "But slavery to your empire won't protect us either. It would only change who destroys us." The brutal honesty of her words sent shockwaves through the Leonid delegation. Prince Thrakis' face contorted with fury at being so directly challenged before representatives of the entire galaxy. "Guards," he commanded. "Retrieve the princess. Now!" This time the Leonid soldiers didn't hesitate. They began removing their armor, preparing to enter the water despite their disadvantage. But before they could act, Sergeant Webb rose from his seat in the back of the gathering. "Your Highness," he called out, addressing Thrakis directly, "might I suggest a different approach?" Every eye turned toward the young human soldier. He looked impossibly small compared to the massive Leonid prince, but he showed no sign of intimidation as he walked forward through the crowd. "You dare," Thrakis began, but Ambassador Chen's voice cut through his anger. "Prince Thrakis, Sergeant Webb, served with distinction in our recent conflicts. Perhaps his perspective might offer valuable insight." The diplomatic phrasing was carefully chosen. Chen was reminding everyone present that the humans, despite their small numbers, had proven surprisingly effective in recent military engagements. Their unconventional tactics had defeated larger forces on multiple occasions. Thrakis' eyes narrowed as he studied the approaching human. "Speak quickly, soldier. My patience grows thin." Webb stopped at the edge of the pool, close enough to Lyralii that she could hear his quiet voice. "Princess, do you truly refuse this marriage of your own free will? No coercion, no outside influence?" "I do," she replied without hesitation. "And you understand the potential consequences of this choice?" Lyralii glanced at her father's stricken face, then at the furious Leonid delegation. "I understand them perfectly." Webb nodded and turned to address the crowd. "Then, according to the Galactic Accords on Sentient Rights, Article 7, the princess has the legal authority to refuse this union." A murmur ran through the gathering. Most delegates were familiar with the accords, though few civilizations took them seriously. The document had been drafted by an idealistic coalition of younger species, including the humans, but the major powers typically ignored any provisions that contradicted their interests. "The Galactic Accords are suggestions, not laws," Thrakis said dismissively. "They have no binding authority over sovereign kingdoms." "Actually," Ambassador Chen interjected, producing a datapad from her diplomatic pouch, "both the Aquatic Kingdom and The Leonid Empire are signatories to the Accords. Your governments accepted their terms in exchange for certain trade privileges with Terran Federation worlds. The reminder sent a ripple of uncomfortable recognition through both delegations. The humans' home systems contained several rare elements essential for advanced starship construction. Access to those resources had required accepting terms that seemed harmless at the time. Legal technicalities won't change the reality of the situation, one of Thrakis' advisors said coldly. The Leonid Empire has invested considerable resources in this alliance. We will not accept its dissolution without compensation. What kind of compensation? King Nerion asked desperately. The Aquatic Kingdom's treasury was substantial, but not unlimited. Complete access to your kingdom's mineral rights, the advisor replied. Exclusive mining contract for the next 50 standard years. And your daughter's hand in marriage to the prince within one solar cycle. The demands were outrageous, clearly designed to be impossible to meet. Lyralii felt her heart sink as she realized the trap that had been laid. The Leonids had never intended this to be a simple marriage alliance. They wanted complete economic control over her people's world. Those terms are unacceptable, she called out from the water. They would reduce my people to indentured servants in their own kingdom. Then, you leave us no choice, Thrakis said with cold satisfaction. The Leonid Empire will consider this a hostile act requiring military response. The threat of war hung over the gathering like a thundercloud. Most of the alien delegations began calculating how quickly they could evacuate their people from what might become a combat zone. But Sergeant Webb stepped forward again, his voice cutting through the tension. Before any irreversible decisions are made, might I suggest an alternative? What alternative could you possibly offer? Thrakis demanded. Your Federation lacks the strength to protect them from our justice. Not protection, Webb replied calmly. A trial by combat. The words hit the gathering like a physical blow. Trial by combat was an ancient tradition among many spacefaring races, including the Leonids. It allowed disputes to be settled through single combat between champions, avoiding the massive casualties of full-scale warfare. Thrakis' eyes lit up with predatory interest. Kumba, you would dare challenge me, human? Not me, Webb said, glancing toward Lyralii. I would serve as the princess's champion, if she'll have me. Another wave of shocked murmurs swept through the crowd. The idea of a human facing a Leonid warrior in single combat seemed like suicide. Thrakis stood nearly 7 feet tall and possessed the natural weapons and armor of his species. Webb looked like a child by comparison. This is madness, King Nerion protested. I cannot allow. The choice isn't yours, Your Majesty, Webb interrupted respectfully. According to Leonid law, any free citizen can serve as champion in a trial by combat. The challenge party has the right to accept or refuse. Lyralii stared at the young human soldier in amazement. He was offering to risk his life for someone he barely knew, with no guarantee of reward or even survival. It was exactly the kind of behavior that had earned humans their strange reputation across the galaxy. You would die for a stranger? She asked quietly. Webb met her eyes across the water. I'd fight for the principle that every being deserves the right to choose their own fate. Whether I win or lose isn't as important as making sure that choice exists. The simple honesty of his words struck her like lightning. Here was someone who understood what she was fighting for, who valued the same ideals that had driven her to reject Thrakis' proposal. Very well, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the ceremonial grounds. Sergeant Marcus Webb, I accept your offer to serve as my champion. Thrakis threw back his head and laughed, the sound like the roar of some great predator. Excellent. I haven't had a proper hunt in months. When shall we schedule this execution? The traditional time is dawn, one of the Leonid advisors said, consulting an ancient text. Single combat with weapons of each fighter's choice. Victory goes to the survivor, or until one yields, Ambassador Chen added pointedly. Leonid warriors don't yield, Thrakis replied with contempt. We fight until death claims the weaker fighter. Webb nodded as if he'd expected this response. Dawn it is, then. I assume there are neutral grounds available. King Nerion gestured weakly toward an area beyond the ceremonial pools. The Circle of Stones has served this purpose for our people for millennia. It provides level ground and clear sight lines for witnesses. Perfect. Thrakis turned his burning gaze toward Webb. Choose your weapons well, little human. They'll be the last tools you ever hold. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with discussion about the unprecedented events they'd witnessed, Lyralii pulled herself from the water. Her ceremonial dress was ruined, but she felt lighter than she had in months. Webb approached as she wrung water from her hair. Up close, she could see the quiet determination in his brown eyes, along with something that might have been fear. He wasn't suicidal. He understood the magnitude of what he'd committed to. Why? She asked simply. Because someone needs to stand up for the idea that strength isn't just about who can hurt others the most, he replied. Your people sound like they've built something worth preserving. That's rare in this galaxy. You could die tomorrow. Maybe. But at least you'll have had the chance to make your own choice, regardless of what happens to me. Lyralii studied his face, searching for signs of false bravado or hidden motives. She found only honest conviction and a quiet courage that impressed her more than all of Thrakis' displays of dominance. Then, I'll make sure your sacrifice means something, she said. Win or lose, my people will remember that someone stood with us when we needed it most. As the evening stars began to appear overhead, Lyralii realized that everything had changed. Tomorrow would bring either freedom or catastrophe, but for the first time in months, she felt hope. The young human soldier had given her something more valuable than protection. He'd given her the chance to fight for what she believed in. Now all that remained was surviving until dawn. Dawn arrived on Voldris with the subtle grace of light filtering through crystal, painting the sky in shades of pearl and silver. The three moons still hung visible in the brightening heavens, pale shadows of their nighttime brilliance. Across the ceremonial grounds, the Circle of Stones waited like an ancient amphitheater carved from the living rock of the planet itself. Princess Lyralii stood at the edge of the fighting circle, her hands clasped tightly before her. She had traded her ruined wedding dress for the simple blue robes of her people, but the weight of royal responsibility still pressed upon her shoulders. Around the circle's perimeter, delegates from across the galaxy had gathered to witness what many believed would be an execution disguised as combat. The Leonid delegation occupied the place of honor, their golden manes gleaming in the morning light. Prince Thrakis stood at their center, magnificent in his ceremonial armor. The metal plates had been crafted to enhance his natural predatory appearance, with stylized claw marks etched into the surface, and a helmet shaped like a snarling feline head. His weapons lay displayed on a cloth nearby, a massive two-handed sword that could cleave through starship hull plating and a neural whip capable of paralyzing most sentient species. Across the circle, Sergeant Marcus Webb made his final preparations with the calm efficiency she'd observed in him since their first meeting. He wore standard Terran Federation combat armor, far lighter than Thrakis' ceremonial plate, but designed for mobility rather than intimidation. His chosen weapons seemed almost pathetic by comparison. A simple plasma rifle and a vibroknife that would have been considered a utility tool on most military bases. Ambassador Chun stood beside Webb, her diplomatic composure failing to completely hide her concern. Are you certain about your equipment choices? Leonid hide is naturally resistant to energy weapons. I know, Webb replied quietly, checking his rifle's power cell one final time. But I'm not planning to fight him the way he expects. Lieutenant Torres, Webb's fellow human soldier, leaned closer. Marcus, you don't have to prove anything here. The princess made her choice. That's what matters. Someone has to stand up, Webb said simply. If we don't defend the right to choose when it's difficult, then it doesn't mean anything when it's easy. King Nerion approached the human delegation with slow, heavy steps. The aquatic kingdom's ruler looked as though he hadn't slept since the previous evening's catastrophe. His advisors had spent the night calculating the potential cost of various outcomes, and None of the projections offered much hope. "Sergeant Webb," the king said formally, "I want you to know that regardless of today's outcome, the Aquatic Kingdom will remember your courage. If you fall in our defense, your name will be honored in our histories." "Thank you, Your Majesty. But I'd rather be remembered as the guy who helped your daughter stay free than as a noble failure." The king's expression softened slightly. "You truly believe you could defeat Prince Thrakis?" Webb considered the question seriously. "I believe that sometimes the right cause can overcome superior strength. We'll find out if today is one of those times." A ceremonial horn sounded across the grounds, its deep note echoing off the ancient stones. The high priest of the Aquatic Kingdom stepped forward, resplendent in robes that seemed to flow like captured water. According to tradition, he would oversee the combat to ensure fair play, though everyone present understood that Leonid concepts of fairness differed dramatically from most galactic standards. "Witnesses of many worlds," the priest intoned, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "we gather to resolve a dispute through the ancient rite of trial by combat. Prince Thrakis of the Leonid Empire challenges the right of Princess Lyralii to refuse their contracted marriage. Sergeant Marcus Webb of the Terran Federation stands as her champion." Murmurs ran through the gathered crowd. Most had traveled here expecting to witness a wedding, not a fight to the death. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. "The rules are simple," the priest continued. "Combat continues until one fighter yields, is rendered unable to continue, or dies. No outside interference will be tolerated. The victor's position will be accepted as truth by all present." Thrakis stepped into the circle with the fluid grace of a born predator. His armor caught the morning light like polished gold, and his amber eyes burned with anticipation. He drew his massive sword with a flourish, the blade humming with energy fields that could cut through most known materials. "I'll make this quick, human," he called out. "Your death will at least serve as an example to others who might question Leonid authority." Webb entered the circle more quietly, his rifle held in a ready position, but not yet aimed. To most observers, he looked impossibly small and fragile compared to his opponent. But Lyralii noticed something in his posture that reminded her of her people's deep-water hunters, a patient stillness that spoke of someone who understood when to strike. "I appreciate the offer," Webb replied calmly, "but I think I'll take my time with this." The apparent casualness of his response sent ripples of amusement through some of the alien delegations. Many species enjoyed displays of courage in the face of certain doom, viewing them as either admirable or entertaining depending on their cultural perspectives. But Lyralii wasn't amused. She was terrified. The horns sounded again, signaling the beginning of combat. Thrakis immediately went on the offensive, his sword carving through the air in devastating arcs that would have bisected most opponents. His fighting style was exactly what she'd expected, overwhelming aggression designed to end fights quickly through superior reach and power. Webb didn't meet the charge head-on. Instead, he moved laterally around the circle's edge, using his rifle to keep distance between himself and the Leonid prince. His first shots were carefully aimed at Thrakis' legs and arms, testing the effectiveness of his weapon against the alien's natural defenses. The plasma bolts struck true, but had minimal effect. Leonid hide was indeed naturally resistant to energy weapons, and Thrakis' armor absorbed what little damage penetrated his biological defenses. The prince laughed as he pursued his smaller opponent around the circle. "Is this the best human tactics can offer? Running and hiding like prey animals?" Webb didn't respond to the taunt. He was too focused on studying his opponent's movement patterns, looking for weaknesses in both the armor and the fighting style. Thrakis was powerful and skilled, but he fought like someone who had rarely faced serious opposition. His techniques were flashy and brutal but predictable. The cat and mouse chase continued for several minutes, with Thrakis growing visibly frustrated at his inability to close with his opponent. The Leonid delegation began shouting encouragement that sounded more like demands for blood. Other observers maintained diplomatic silence, though several alien species were clearly taking mental notes on human combat doctrine. Ambassador Chun watched with the trained eye of someone who had seen her people fight against overwhelming odds before. "He's buying time," she murmured to Lieutenant Torres, learning everything he can about his opponent. "Will it be enough?" Torres asked quietly. "It has to be." In the circle, Webb suddenly changed tactics. Instead of continuing his retreat, he dropped to one knee and began firing rapid bursts at a specific point on Thrakis' armor. The plasma bolts struck the same chest plate repeatedly, each hit weakening the metal's molecular structure slightly. Thrakis noticed the change and charged forward with renewed fury. His sword swept down in a blow that would have split the human in half, but Webb rolled aside at the last moment. The blade struck the stone floor of the circle, sending sparks flying and leaving a deep gouge in the ancient rock. As Thrakis struggled to free his weapon from the stone, Webb rose to his feet and fired 3 more shots at the weakened armor plate. The metal finally gave way, exposing a small area of the prince's natural hide beneath. The crowd leaned forward in sudden interest. For the first time, the human had found a way to potentially hurt his opponent. But Thrakis recovered faster than Webb had anticipated. The prince abandoned his sword temporarily and lunged forward with his claws extended, trying to grapple the smaller fighter. Webb barely managed to avoid the attack, but the prince's claws caught his rifle and sent it spinning across the circle. Now both fighters were armed only with their secondary weapons, Thrakis' neural whip and Webb's vibroknife. The disparity in reach still favored the Leonid prince, but the gap had narrowed considerably. "No more running, human," Thrakis snarled, drawing his whip from his belt. The weapon crackled with neural disruption fields that could incapacitate most species with a single touch. "Time to face your death with what honor you can manage." Webb drew his knife, its molecular edge humming with barely contained energy. The weapon looked pitiful compared to the whip, but he held it with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it effectively. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about strength and weakness." "Philosophy won't save you now," Thrakis replied, testing his whip with a few experimental cracks that left glowing afterimages in the air. "Maybe not, but I think you're wrong about what makes someone strong." The prince attacked without warning, his whip snaking through the air toward Webb's torso. The human twisted aside, but the neural field still grazed his armor. Electric pain shot through his nervous system, and he stumbled slightly. Thrakis pressed his advantage, following up with a series of whip strikes that forced Webb to give ground. Each near miss sent crackling energy through the air, and the few hits that connected clearly caused significant pain. The human's movements became more labored as the neural disruption accumulated. "You see," Thrakis called out between attacks, "this is what happens when inferior beings challenge their betters. Your weapons, your tactics, your very physiology mark you as prey." But even as he spoke, the prince was breathing harder than he should have been. His armor, designed for intimidation rather than extended combat, was heavier than Webb's practical gear. The human's refusal to be pinned down was forcing him to work harder than anticipated. Webb used a momentary pause to wipe blood from a cut on his cheek. "You're right about one thing," he admitted. "Individually, you're stronger, faster, and better armed than I am." Finally, some honesty from the prey. But that's not the only kind of strength that matters. Webb's tone had changed, becoming colder and more focused. For the first time since the combat began, he stopped retreating and took a step forward. Thrakis raised his whip for another strike, but Webb was already moving. Instead of dodging sideways as he had been doing, the human charged straight forward. The whip lashed out, but Webb dropped into a sliding tackle that carried him beneath the weapon's arc. His vibroknife found the gap in Thrakis' armor that his rifle had created earlier. The molecular edge sliced through Leonid hide like it was paper, drawing a roar of pain and rage from the prince. But Webb wasn't finished. As Thrakis staggered backward, the human rolled to his feet and launched himself at his opponent's legs. The knife found another gap in the armor, this one at the knee joint. Suddenly, the dynamic of the fight had shifted. Thrakis was wounded and off balance, while Webb pressed his advantage with the ruthless efficiency of someone who understood that mercy would mean death. The prince tried to bring his whip around, but Webb was too close for the weapon to be effective. The human grabbed Thrakis' wrist and used his own momentum to flip the larger alien over his shoulder. Leonid physiology was powerful, but not designed for grappling with opponents who understood leverage and momentum. Thrakis hit the stone floor hard, his armor clanging against the ancient rock. Before he could recover, Webb was on top of him, the vibro knife pressed against the prince's throat. "Yield," Webb said quietly. The circle fell silent except for the sound of both fighters breathing heavily. Thrakis' amber eyes burned with fury and humiliation, but the blade at his throat was steady as starlight. "I don't yield to inferior species," the prince snarled. "Then you don't understand what strength really means," Webb replied. "It's not about who can hurt others the most. It's about protecting what matters, even when the odds are against you." For a long moment, the two fighters stared at each other. The assembled delegates held their breath, waiting to see if the human would deliver the killing blow. Instead, Webb slowly withdrew his knife and stepped back. "The combat is over," he announced to the crowd. "Prince Thrakis is defeated but alive. Princess Lyraliai's right to refuse the marriage stands." Thrakis struggled to sit up, his face a mask of rage and confusion. "You could have killed me. Why didn't you?" Webb looked down at him with something that might have been pity. "Because proving you wrong was more important than proving I could kill you." The simple statement hit the gathered crowd like a thunderbolt. In a galaxy where disputes were typically settled through superior firepower, the human had chosen mercy over vengeance. Princess Lyraliai stepped into the circle, her eyes bright with tears of relief and gratitude. "Sergeant Webb, I owe you a debt I can never repay." "No debt," he replied, turning to face her. "Just remember that strength comes in many forms. Your people's wisdom and compassion are just as valuable as any empire's warships." As the sun climbed higher into Valdris's sky, the implications of what had just happened began to sink in. A human soldier had defeated a Leonid prince in single combat, but, more importantly, he had done it in service of a principle that most galactic civilizations considered naive idealism. The right to choose one's own fate had been defended with blood and courage. And across the galaxy, that would be remembered. The aftermath of the trial by combat rippled through the assembled delegations like shockwaves from a stellar explosion. Representatives from dozens of worlds clustered in urgent discussion groups, their translators working overtime as the implications of what they'd witnessed began to sink in. A human had defeated a Leonid prince in single combat. More shocking still, he had chosen mercy over the kill. Prince Thrakis remained seated on the stone floor of the circle, his golden armor dented and his pride shattered beyond easy repair. Blood seeped from the wounds Webb had inflicted, but the physical damage was nothing compared to the humiliation of being bested by what he considered an inferior species. His amber eyes tracked the human soldier with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "This isn't over," Thrakis said quietly, his voice carrying only to those nearest the circle. "The Leonid Empire doesn't forget debts of honor." Ambassador Chen approached the fallen prince with careful diplomatic steps. "Your Highness, the Terran Federation hopes this resolution will lead to better understanding between our peoples. Perhaps this incident can be the beginning of more productive dialogue." Thrakis' laugh was bitter as crystallized poison. "Dialogue? You humiliated me before the entire galaxy. My own people will question my fitness to rule after this display. Then maybe you should consider why you lost," Webb said, finally, allowing exhaustion to show in his posture. The neural disruption from the whip had taken its toll, and maintaining combat readiness had drained his reserves. "It wasn't because I'm stronger than you." "Then why?" The question came out like a challenge, but there was genuine confusion beneath the anger. Webb looked at the prince thoughtfully. "Because you were fighting for your own pride, and I was fighting for something bigger than myself. That changes everything." King Nerion stepped forward, his relief at his daughter's freedom warring with concern about the political consequences. The aquatic kingdom had just avoided one catastrophe, but others might be approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. Prince Thrakis, the king said formally, while we regret the unfortunate end to our marriage negotiations, perhaps we can discuss alternative arrangements that might benefit both our peoples. Thrakis rose slowly to his feet, his movements stiff from his injuries. What arrangements could possibly compensate for this insult? Trade agreements, King Nerion replied hopefully. Mining rights to selected systems. Cultural exchanges. There are many ways our kingdoms might cooperate without the need for dynastic marriage. My father will demand satisfaction for this humiliation, Thrakis said coldly. The Leonid Empire's reputation depends on maintaining our strength in the eyes of potential enemies. Princess Lyralii stepped between her father and the prince, her blue robes still damp from her morning prayers in the ceremonial pools. Then, tell your father that the aquatic kingdom stands ready to defend our independence. We may not have the largest fleet in the galaxy, but we have allies who value freedom over conquest. She glanced meaningfully at the human delegation. The message was clear. An attack on her world would bring the Terran Federation into the conflict. Ambassador, Chen nodded slightly. The Federation's mutual defense treaties are quite comprehensive. We believe strongly in supporting the sovereignty of our partners. The diplomatic dance continued for several minutes, with various alien representatives offering their own perspectives on the situation. Some species were openly impressed by the humans' display of combat skill and moral restraint. Others worried about the precedent of allowing individual choice to override political necessity. But Webb found himself focused on a different concern. He pulled Lieutenant Torres aside, speaking quietly. Maria, get a message back to command. They need to know what happened here, and they need to prepare for possible Leonid retaliation. You think they'll come after our colonies? Torres asked. I think a proud warrior culture that just got embarrassed in public will need to restore their reputation somehow. Our worlds are smaller and less defended than the aquatic kingdom. The fleet's spread pretty thin right now. Most of our ships are dealing with those pirate raids in the outer systems. Webb nodded grimly. Then, we'll have to hope diplomacy works better than it usually does. As if summoned by his words, one of the Leonid advisors approached their position. The alien was smaller than Thrakis, but carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Humans, the advisor said, his accent making the words sound like an insult. You have placed our empire in a difficult position. Prince Thrakis' defeat will be seen as weakness by our enemies. That's not our problem, Torres replied bluntly. Isn't it? The advisor's smile was all predator. The Terran Federation has perhaps 50 worlds, most of them lightly defended. It would be unfortunate if pirates in your space became more aggressive or if shipping accidents began affecting your trade routes. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Webb studied the alien's face carefully, memorizing details that might become important later. Are you speaking for your government? He asked quietly. I speak for those who understand that actions have consequences. The galaxy is a dangerous place for small, idealistic nations. Before Webb could respond, Princess Lyralii appeared at his shoulder. Her presence seemed to bring calm to the tense conversation. Counselor Rathek, she said, addressing the Leonid advisor by name, I couldn't help but overhear your concerns about galactic security. Perhaps you'd be interested to know that the Aquatic Kingdom has recently completed negotiations for expanded patrol agreements with several neighboring systems. The advisor's expression darkened. What manner of agreements? Mutual defense pacts with the Crystalline Consortium, the Avian Collectives, and, of course, the Terra Federation. Any aggressive action against one signatory would trigger coordinated response from all members. Webb blinked in surprise. This was news to him, and based on Torres' expression, it was news to the entire human delegation. When were these agreements finalized? Rathek demanded. About 10 minutes ago, Lyralii replied smoothly. Ambassador Chun was kind enough to facilitate communications with the other delegations. It's remarkable how quickly like-minded peoples can reach understanding when they share common values. The advisor looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. The Leonid Empire was powerful, but taking on a defensive alliance of 5 different star nations would be a much more complex proposition than intimidating isolated systems. "You're bluffing," he said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Ambassador Chun materialized beside them with the perfect timing of an experienced diplomat. "Actually, the preliminary documents are being drafted as we speak. The Terran Senate is quite enthusiastic about expanding our mutual defense network." Webb realized he was witnessing a masterpiece of improvised diplomacy. Whether or not the alliance agreements were real, the threat of them was enough to make the Leonids think twice about immediate retaliation. King Nerion joined the conversation with his own contribution. "Of course, such an alliance would require permanent Federation bases in our space. For coordination purposes, you understand. I believe Admiral Harrison has been looking for a forward staging area in this sector." The implications hit the Leonid delegation like a fusion torpedo. A permanent Terran Federation military presence near their borders would complicate any expansion plans they might have for the region. Prince Thrakus had been listening to the exchange with growing frustration. "Enough of this diplomatic theater. You won this round, humans, but the game isn't over. The Leonid Empire has a long memory and longer reach. So does the Federation," Webb replied calmly. "And we have friends who share our values." "Values," Thrakus spat. "Your precious ideals won't protect you when real power comes calling." "They protected the princess today," Webb pointed out. "Maybe they're stronger than you think." For a moment, the two warriors stared at each other across a gulf of fundamental philosophical difference. Thrakus saw strength in terms of domination and control. Webb saw it in terms of protection and principle. The moment was broken by the arrival of another group of alien delegates. These were representatives of the Crystalline Consortium, beings who looked like living geometric patterns of colored light. Their leader pulsed with shades of deep blue and silver as it addressed the gathering. "The Consortium has observed these proceedings with great interest," it said in harmonics that required translation devices to understand. "We find a human approach to conflict resolution intriguing." "How so?" Ambassador Chen asked, though Webb suspected she already knew where this was leading. "Your species chooses principle over pragmatism, cooperation over conquest. This aligns with Consortium values more closely than the traditional galactic power structure." Another piece clicked into place on the diplomatic game board. The Crystalline Consortium controlled several key trade routes and had remained neutral in most galactic conflicts. Their support would add considerable weight to any alliance. Counselor Rathek's expression had progressed from angry to deeply concerned. "The Leonid Empire has been a stabilizing force in this galaxy for millennia. These naive experiments in idealistic governance will lead to chaos when serious threats emerge." "What threats?" Princess Lyralii asked innocently. "The pirates your empire has been unable to stop? The hive fleets that haven't been seen for generations? Or do you refer to the threat of peoples choosing their own destinies?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Many of the assembled delegates had their own experiences with Leonid stabilization, efforts that looked remarkably similar to conquest from the receiving end. Webb watched the political maneuvering with growing amazement. What had started as a simple trial by combat was transforming into a potential realignment of regional power structures. The princess and Ambassador Chun were proving that human tactical thinking wasn't limited to military applications. Perhaps, the crystalline representative suggested, it would be beneficial to establish a formal council for discussing these matters. A forum where different approaches to galactic governance could be evaluated. "The Galactic Council already serves that function," Rathek objected. "The Galactic Council is dominated by the largest military powers," Chen replied diplomatically. "Perhaps it's time for a more representative body." Webb began to understand the magnitude of what he'd set in motion by accepting Lyralii's request for a champion. His victory over Prince Thrakus hadn't just freed one princess from an unwanted marriage. It had demonstrated that the galaxy's traditional power structures could be challenged successfully. That was a dangerous precedent for empires built on intimidation and force. This conversation has been illuminating, Prince Thrakis said finally, his voice thick with controlled rage. But words are just words. Reality has a way of asserting itself eventually. He turned and stalked away, his damaged armor clanking with each step. The rest of the Leonid delegation followed, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were returning home with news of defeat and humiliation. As the Imperial Party departed, Webb felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. The immediate crisis had passed, but he understood that larger challenges lay ahead. Well, he said to no one in particular, I guess we'll find out how much trouble one trial by combat can cause. Princess Lyralii placed a gentle hand on his arm. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. That's what allies do. Webb looked around at the mixed group of humans and aliens who had somehow coalesced into an impromptu alliance. It wasn't the strongest coalition in galactic terms, but it represented something new, a gathering of peoples united by shared values rather than mutual fear. That might just be enough to change everything. 3 months after the trial by combat on Valdris, the galaxy had begun to reshape itself in ways no one could have predicted. The story of a human soldier defeating a Leonid prince to defend an alien princess's right to choose her own fate had spread through hyperspace communications networks like wildfire. On some worlds, it was dismissed as an amusing curiosity. On others, it sparked revolutions. Sergeant Marcus Webb stood on the observation deck of the Terran Federation starship Defiance, watching the blue-green world of New Geneva rotate slowly beneath them. The ship was one of several Federation vessels now permanently stationed in what had become known as the Valdris Sector, part of the mutual defense agreements that had been hastily formalized in the aftermath of Princess Lyralii's wedding that never was. Still can't believe we're actually here, Lieutenant Torres said, joining him at the viewport. 6 months ago, this whole sector was considered Leonid territory. Things change fast when people decide they don't want to be conquered anymore, Webb replied, watching a convoy of Aquatic Kingdom transport ships pass beneath them. The vessels were carrying refined minerals to various Federation colonies, part of the trade agreements that had made their alliance economically viable as well as militarily necessary. The door to the observation deck chimed, and Ambassador Chen entered with Princess Lyralii close behind. The princess had traded her traditional Aquatic Kingdom robes for a practical uniform that marked her new role as liaison between the growing alliance of independent worlds. The council meeting is ready to begin, Chen announced. The Crystalline Consortium and Avian Collective representatives have both arrived, and we have delegations from 6 other systems interested in joining our mutual defense network. Webb nodded, though he still felt strange about being included in high-level diplomatic discussions. His defeat of Prince Thrakis had somehow made him a symbol of the Alliance's ideals, a role he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Any word from the Outer Rim colonies? He asked. Lyralii's expression darkened slightly. 3 more Federation outposts have gone silent in the past week. The pirates are becoming more aggressive, and their tactics are improving. Someone is coordinating their efforts. They all knew who that someone likely was. The Leonid Empire hadn't responded to their humiliation with direct military action, but proxy warfare was an old Imperial tradition. Funding and training pirates to harass enemy shipping was both cost-effective and deniable. The group made their way to the ship's main conference room, where representatives of the Free World Alliance had gathered. The name itself had been Webb's suggestion during one of the early organizational meetings. It reflected their core principle, that worlds should be free to choose their own governments and destinies without interference from expansionist empires. The conference room buzzed with a dozen different languages as the assembled delegates discussed the latest intelligence reports. The Crystalline Consortium's representative pulsed with urgent patterns of red and orange light. The Avian Collective's envoy ruffled her feathered crest in agitation. Even the usually calm representatives from the botanical worlds seemed tense. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings, Ambassador Chun called the meeting to order. We face an escalating crisis. Pirate attacks on our shipping lanes have increased by 300% in the past month. Our outlying colonies are requesting additional protection, but our combined fleets are stretched to their limits. Admiral Sarah Martinez, commanding officer of the Federation's Sixth Fleet, activated the holographic display in the center of the table. Red markers appeared throughout the local star cluster, each one representing a recent attack. The pattern is clear, Martinez said grimly. The raids are systematically targeting our most vulnerable trade routes and supply lines. This isn't random piracy. Someone is trying to strangle our alliance economically. The crystalline representative's patterns shifted to deep blue. The consortium has lost 17 cargo vessels in the past 6 weeks. Our merchant guilds are demanding escort vessels for all shipments, which we don't have, added the avian delegate, her voice carrying the musical tones of her species. Our patrol fleets were designed to defend fixed positions, not escort convoys across half the galaxy. Princess Lyralii leaned forward, her silver eyes reflecting the red glow of the attack markers. Has there been any response from the Galactic Council regarding our request for assistance? Chin's expression provided the answer before she spoke. The Council's official position is that piracy is a local enforcement matter. They've offered to mediate negotiations with the raiders if we're interested in paying tribute. Tribute, Webb said flatly. They want us to pay protection money to criminals. It's a time-honored solution, Chin replied with diplomatic irony. Pay the pirates to attack someone else's shipping instead of ours. Which proves that the Council is either completely corrupt or completely useless, Torres muttered. Admiral Martinez highlighted a new section of the display. There is one piece of good news. Our intelligence networks have identified the pirates' main staging area. They're operating out of the Shadowfall system, about 15 light-years from here. Webb studied the tactical display with interest. Shadowfall was a dead system with several asteroid belts that would provide excellent cover for hidden bases. It was also dangerously close to the main shipping lanes between Federation space and the Alliance worlds. What kind of defenses are we looking at, he asked. Unknown. The system is heavily mined, and any ship approaching gets attacked before they can gather detailed intelligence. We estimate at least 30 pirate vessels, possibly more. Lyralii pulled up additional data on her personal display. The Leonid Empire has been suspiciously quiet about the pirate problem. Their merchant ships travel the same routes as ours, but they haven't reported a single attack. Because they're paying for safe passage, the avian representative said bluntly. Or because they're the ones giving the orders. Admiral Martinez nodded grimly. Our analysts believe the Leonid Empire is using the pirates as a weapon against our alliance. They can't attack us directly without triggering a full-scale war, but supporting independent raiders gives them plausible deniability. So what do we do about it? Webb asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge. The Free World Alliance had been formed around principles of cooperation and mutual defense, but they were facing an enemy that refused to fight honorably. Pirates struck without warning and disappeared into the void before defenders could respond. There is one option, Princess Lyralii said quietly, but it would require taking significant risks. All eyes turned to her. As the Alliance's youngest member world, the Aquatic Kingdom often brought fresh perspectives to strategic problems. What are you thinking? Ambassador, Chen asked. A stealth insertion into the Shadowfall system. A small team with a specific mission. Gather intelligence on the pirate forces, identify their command structure, and, if possible, disrupt their operations from within. Admiral Martinez shook her head. Too dangerous. Any ship entering that system would be detected and destroyed before it could accomplish anything useful. Not a ship, Lyralii said with a slight smile. A person. Webb felt a chill of recognition. He'd seen that expression before, just before the princess had refused to marry Prince Thrakus. It was the look of someone who had made a decision that others would consider insane. Explain, Chun said carefully. My people are natural swimmers and divers. We can survive in environments that would kill most other species. The Shadowfall system includes several water worlds that the pirates use for resupply. I could infiltrate one of their bases, gather the intelligence we need, and escape before they realized what had happened. Absolutely not, Webb said immediately. It's suicide. Is it more suicide than facing a Leonid prince in single combat? Lyrelii asked with raised eyebrows. That's different. I knew what I was getting into. So do I. Admiral Martinez was studying the tactical display with new interest. Actually, it might work. The pirates wouldn't expect a solo infiltrator, especially not one capable of underwater approach. Most spacers are terrified of deep water, which is exactly why this is a terrible idea, Torres interjected. We're talking about sending one person against an entire pirate fleet. Not to fight them, Lyrelii clarified. To gather intelligence. Once we know their capabilities and command structure, we can plan an effective military response. The debate continued for another hour, with various delegates offering alternatives and modifications to the plan. But Webb could see that Lyrelii had already made up her mind. She was going to attempt this mission regardless of what the council decided. Finally, Chen called for a formal vote. The resolution passed by a narrow margin, authorizing Princess Lyrelii to attempt a reconnaissance mission into the Shadowfall system. I have one condition, Webb said as the meeting concluded. If she's going, I'm going with her. Marcus, Lyrelii said gently, this isn't your fight. Neither was your wedding, he replied. But someone needs to watch your back, and I'm volunteering. Admiral Martinez looked between them with exasperation. This is turning into the most dangerous diplomatic mission in Federation history. Maybe that's what it takes, Ambassador Chen said thoughtfully. Conventional diplomacy hasn't worked. Conventional military tactics haven't worked. Perhaps it's time to try something unconventional. 2 days later, Webb found himself aboard a modified reconnaissance pod, approaching the edge of the Shadowfall system. The vessel was barely larger than a shuttle, designed to avoid detection by running silent and cold. Beside him, Princess Lyrelii reviewed the intelligence data one final time. Still think this is crazy, he muttered, checking his environmental suit systems. Of course it's crazy, she replied cheerfully. That's why it might actually work. The pod's sensors detected the first pirate patrol ships at the system's outer edge. The vessels were modified civilian freighters with military-grade weapons grafted onto their hulls. They moved in efficient search patterns that suggested professional training rather than random criminal activity. Definitely not ordinary pirates, Webb observed. No, these are military units pretending to be criminals. That confirms the Leonid connection. Their target was a water world in the system's third orbit, identified by intelligence as a major refueling station for the pirate fleet. The planet's surface was entirely ocean, with floating platforms serving as spaceports and supply depots. Remember the plan? Lyrelii said as they prepared for insertion. Get in, gather data on their fleet strength and command structure, get out. No heroics, says the woman who just volunteered to swim into a pirate base. That's different. This is my area of expertise. Webb shook his head but said nothing. In the months since their first meeting, he'd learned that arguing with the princess was usually futile. She had inherited her people's patience and wisdom, but also their stubborn determination. The insertion went smoothly. Their pod slipped past the orbital patrols and entered the planet's atmosphere without triggering any alarms. They descended toward the ocean's surface, where thermal vents would mask their energy signature. As they approached the water, Webb caught his first glimpse of the pirate installation. Dozens of ships floated at anchor around a massive platform that could have serviced half the Federation fleet. This wasn't a temporary raider base. It was a permanent military facility designed for extended operations. We're going to need a bigger alliance, he said grimly. Princess Lyrelii was already suiting up for the underwater approach. Her environmental gear looked like a second skin, designed to enhance her natural aquatic abilities rather than replace them. Ready? She asked. Webb checked his own equipment one final time. His suit was bulkier and more mechanical, designed to keep an air-breathing human alive in an alien environment. Ready, he confirmed. They slipped into the dark waters of the alien world, beginning a mission that would either provide the intelligence needed to save their alliance or get them both killed in the attempt. Either way, Webb reflected as they descended into the depths, it was better than watching their worlds burn while they did nothing. The fight for freedom had taken them to the bottom of an ocean on a hostile world. But that was where the real work of building a better galaxy had to begin, in the dark, dangerous places where no one else was willing to go. As they approached the pirate installation, Webb realized that this mission would determine not just the fate of their alliance, but the future of the entire galactic community. The choice between freedom and tyranny would be decided here, in the depths of an alien sea. And, despite the overwhelming odds against them, he found himself smiling. After all, humans had always done their best work when everyone else said it was impossible.